For over 1 billion Muslims, the Prophet Muhammad is the ultimate guide, the perfect example of how to live a worthy life. He's revered, he's emulated, he's deeply loved. But what happens when the historical texts that we rely on to know him paint a picture that's complex, contested, and for some, pretty problematic? Okay, let's get into it.
So the traditional Islamic view holds the Prophet up as al-Insan al-Kamil, which means the perfect human. And this isn't just a fancy title, it's a core belief. It presents a figure whose every single action is seen as this perfect blueprint for piety, for justice, for mercy. This is the image that's cherished by Muslims all over the world.
And right here, this is where the tension really begins. The source material we're looking at today argues that relying on certain historical texts has created what it calls a messy, muddled, and much maligned role model. You end up with this profound conflict between the ideal of the perfect man and the actual details found in the very books that are supposed to preserve his legacy.
So how do people deal with that tension? Well, the sources suggest there are two fundamentally different ways to look at the Prophet's life, each based on a completely distinct way of reading history. We're going to unpack both of these portraits and the evidence they're built on. Okay, so let's break this down. On one side, you have traditional Islam. This approach relies heavily on the huge collections of Sahih Hadith. These are reports of the Prophet's sayings and actions, to build a super detailed, certain model of his life. The whole point is to copy him as closely as you possibly can. But then, on the other side, you've got this modern framework called BioIslam, and it says, hold on, we just can't know the details with that much certainty. Instead, it suggests we use a filter. Any historical claim has to line up with the core ethical spirit of the Quran. If it doesn't, it's out.
To really get how these two approaches work in the real world, we have to look at some of the most difficult stories in the historical record. Our first case study is the Prophet's marriage to Aisha. And it's really important to say, the details we're about to discuss are found even in the works of very popular traditional scholars, though their conclusions are worlds apart.
The difference here is just incredibly stark. The traditional account, which comes from what's considered the most authentic book of hadith, Sahih al-Bukhari, says that the marriage was consummated when the Prophet was in his 50s and Aisha was 9. For traditionalists, the source is so strong that this is considered a historical fact. But the BioIslam position, it rejects this completely. The argument is that an act like this is innately and deeply disgusting, and it just fundamentally clashes with the Quran's moral spirit. So they conclude the report itself has to be wrong.
So you might be wondering, why is this one hadith so hard for traditional scholars to just dismiss? Well, the answer comes down to a really key term, mutawatir. See, this isn't just any old report. A mutawatir hadith is one that's been passed down through so many different, independent, and reliable chains of narrators, what they call an isnad, that to deny it would, in their view, be like questioning the entire system of preserving history. It's about as close to a certainty as you can possibly get in that field.
So how do traditional scholars defend this? Well, the arguments usually fall into a few categories. First, they'll say this was never an issue until Western critics brought it up. Second, they warn against something called presentism, judging the past by our modern values. They say it was a different time, different customs. But that creates a really tricky paradox, right? If the Prophet is a role model for all time, how can his actions be defended as only being okay for his time? Some conservative figures solve this by just arguing the practice is still valid today. And this quote just brilliantly lays out the BioIslam counter-argument. For them, the whole process is flipped on its head. It's not about defending a historical text no matter what. It's about using the Quran's timeless ethical framework as the main measuring stick. If a historical report, no matter how strongly it's authenticated, violates that core ethos, then that report is considered super unlikely and, more importantly, religiously irrelevant.
All right, let's take that same framework and apply it to a second case study. This one is also pretty controversial. It involves the Prophet's marriage to Zainab, who was the ex-wife of his adopted son, Zayd.
This timeline is fascinating because it shows that this story wasn't set in stone. It actually evolved over centuries. Early historians like El-Tabari tell a very human story where the Prophet saw Zainab and liked her, which eventually led to her divorce. But hundreds of years later, scholars started to feel like this story of human emotion was unbefitting of a prophet. So a sanitized version popped up, pushed by scholars like Al-Qurtubi, which framed the whole thing as being preordained by God. And by the time you get to the famous scholar Ibn Kathir, that earlier, more human version has basically been scrubbed from the mainstream story. The BioIslam position just cuts right through this whole debate. It says that both versions of the story, the one about a prophet overcome with human desire and the sanitized one suggesting God had to step in to make it happen, both of them clash with the Quran's idea of prophetic dignity. In their view, either story makes the prophet seem driven by personal wants, which goes against the Quran's picture of a messenger focused on a divine mission. So they just label the whole episode as highly unlikely and move on.
So these case studies really show a deep, deep divide in methodology. And that brings us to the underlying framework that leads to such different conclusions in the first place. Let's take a closer look at the BioIslam approach itself.
So, what exactly is BioIslam? Well, as it's defined in the source material, it's a modern way of thinking about the faith. Its main job is to act as a filter. It raises the moral and ethical principles of the Quran to be the #1 unshakable source of truth. Every other text, all written centuries later, is secondary and has to be tested against it.
And here's how that filter works in practice. It's basically 4 steps. First, you anchor yourself in the core principles of the Quran. Second, you look at a post-Quranic report, like a hadith. Third, and this is the most important part, you test it. Does this report vibe with the Quran's ethos of justice, mercy, and ethics? If the answer is no, you go to step 4. The report gets labeled dark matter. That's their term for information that is historically fuzzy and, crucially, religiously irrelevant. You just set it aside.
Now, you might be thinking, okay, this is all very academic, very theological, but the people who advocate for the BioIslam framework argue that the way a community views its most important role model has huge, real-world consequences for society today.
According to the source, the whole point of this re-examination is to tackle what it calls the Big 5 problems, plaguing many Muslim-majority societies. The argument goes that a worldview based on taqlid, which means blind acceptance of all these historical texts, helps create the foundation for these issues. So, for example, if you take a report that shows the prophet as an absolute ruler as a literal blueprint, it can be used to justify modern authoritarianism. If another text is used to limit women's roles, it can reinforce patriarchy. By questioning the absolute infallibility of these later texts, the framework hopes to unlock progress on these really deep-seated challenges.
And this is the final piece of the puzzle. The central argument is that when the most important role model in the entire faith is portrayed with these problematic and malign traits, it creates a foundation that can be used to excuse modern problems. They argue that reforming that historical picture is a crucial first step towards solving these challenges today.
So we end up right back where we started, but with a much bigger question. This whole debate within Islam really highlights a universal challenge. For any tradition with ancient roots, how do you handle that friction between historical texts, which are always a product of their time, and the timeless moral and ethical ideals that are supposed to guide you today? That is the fundamental question that this whole re-examination leaves us with.